Hi, thank you for joining our webinar. We will be going over coverage analysis for oncology studies today. My name is Nicole Brooker, and I'll be presenting with my colleague Ryan Guile. In terms of what we'll be talking about today, we'll be looking at the various roles that are important in terms of oncology research billing compliance, both before and after the study opens. The billing compliance team has information that the coordinators need throughout the study, coordinators complete review of charges, and just in general, the coverage analysis helps guide financial and billing discussions with the patient. There's also local and federal laws related to billing compliance that need to be followed. And it's important that patients receive correct bills and do not get charged for anything that the study sponsor is paying for. And in general, there's consequences for non-compliance. So that's just kind of a general overview of some of the important areas of billing compliance and what we'll be talking about today. So why is billing compliance important? As I mentioned, there's local and federal laws related to patient billing, and those laws must be followed. It's important that patients get charged appropriately, and there isn't double billing in terms of them paying for items covered by the sponsor, and there's serious federal consequences for noncompliance. Just a quick overview in terms of the history of billing compliance. It started when Medicare began to provide coverage for routine items within a clinical trial. In '94, Medicare started covering investigational devices. In 2000, the clinical trial policy was introduced. This is NC 310.1. And in '07, there were updates to this policy. In terms of the impacts of some of the occurrences related to billing compliances, there were started to be fines assessed, pretty significant dollar amounts involved, and there's some well-known examples where these fines were assessed to various institutions. Related to all this, sites began to develop coverage analysis processes. It's important to have a system to know what will and will not be billed to the patient and their insurance. And as we'll go over today, billing compliance is much more than having just a coverage analysis on file. A little general background in terms of billing compliance and some of the important aspects and policies that relate to billing compliance. The first being NCD 310.1, which is the clinical trial policy. It's the basis of billing compliance for non-device studies. It states that Medicare will cover routine costs of a qualifying clinical trial, and it defines what each of these terms mean. There's also a Medicare Benefit Policy Manual, Chapter 14. This applies to IDE devices. We won't really go over device studies in detail today, since most oncology trials are not device studies, although they do come up. But just for general background information, Chapter 14 is the basis of billing compliance for device studies. And similarly to NC 310.1, Medicare will cover routine care items for certain device types per Chapter 14. Another general topic to be aware of is Medicare coverage with evidence development. It's a program for Medicare to collect additional data about certain items or services in order to determine if and when the item should be covered for the patient. It provides coverage for certain items and services only in the context of an approved clinical trial and or submission of data to a registry. There are several different areas where Medicare coverage with evidence development applies. Medicare has a website that lists all of these items and services, and depending on the specific item or service, there are certain stipulations involved for them in terms of billing. So really the main issue with billing compliance is double billing. So that would be billing the patient or their insurance for an item that the sponsor is paying for, so it's being a duplicate payment. Some other issues that can occur related to billing compliance include improper billing, so billing the patient or their insurance for non-covered items, and then inconsistent billing between patients. So essentially, if there's the same circumstances for the same patient, if one patient is getting it free because the sponsor is paying for it and the other has their insurance paying for it, that's problematic. There are several different consequences for non-compliance. Just quickly running through a couple examples, there's fines, paybacks, and penalties, increased government scrutiny, costs associated with investigation and action plans, loss of current or future federal grants, bad publicity, reputational harm, and unhappy patients. So we'll go into some of the consequences a little further in terms of the impact that they can have for the site. In terms of audits, fines, paybacks, and investigations, they're concerned to sponsors. So it might be difficult to get selected for studies if the sponsor is aware of consequences or issues that occurred at a given institution. There could be loss of federal funds. There might be an inability to participate in federally funded studies and or grants. Bad PR, patients might be less willing to enroll in the study if they hear about audits or improper billing. And then unhappy patients is also an effect. So generally speaking, patients in a trial are already fairly sick patients who have a lot of bills and can cause a lot of additional stress if they're receiving bills improperly. So what exactly is a coverage analysis? Really the main goal is getting at what I mentioned earlier, which is the main problem with billing compliance, duplicate billing. The goal of the coverage analysis is to determine if the study sponsor or the patient or their insurance will be paying for each item or service required by the study. It's important that it's clear that there's just one patient, either the patient or the sponsor. So besides determining the financial responsibility of the given items or services in terms of whether it goes to the patient or the sponsor, there's a couple other reasons for doing a coverage analysis. This includes doing a comprehensive analysis of all the clinical trial documents to make sure that they are consistent. It's really the basis of billing compliance, so it's an important tool that should be utilized by multiple parties to ensure that billing compliance is maintained. You can also use as a budget building tool. So in doing the coverage analysis and determining a single payer for each item or service, that information can be used to determine what should be included in a sponsor budget, since all those items are clearly going to be marked in the coverage analysis. In terms of the information needed to develop a coverage analysis, there's a couple different items, including the protocol, sponsor budget, contract, consent form, and potentially details for the study team. In terms of the protocol, there's reviewing the actual protocol calendar in terms of the items being done in the study and when they're occurring in the study, but also just a general review of the protocol is recommended in terms of some items that could be occurring in the study but not necessarily included in the calendar. Study eligibility is a common area we see where items might be required but not specifically included in the protocol calendar. The sponsor budget is important. Both sites, if the sponsor is offering to pay for an item, will accept payment. So reviewing that in terms of what the sponsor is initially offering to pay for. The contract, there's a couple different areas that are valuable in the contract in terms of coverage analysis. One such area is the provision of the investigational drug. The consent form, generally speaking, the consent form contains cost language for the patient. So it's important that this cost language is consistent with the contract and the sponsor budget. And details from the study team. This can be dependent on the trial. If it's a complex trial or perhaps the protocol documents aren't clear, there might be some information needed from the study team, and we'll go into a couple examples later on. In terms of the information included in the coverage analysis, it's intended for billers, budgeters, and the clinical team. It shows protocol-required visits and the activities occurring at each visit. There's analysis for why the patient should or should not be billed for each of the required items or services. Generally speaking, the HCPCS or CPT codes are included for the individual items, and the research billing modifier for each item is included. So this is just kind of a quick snapshot of what a coverage analysis might look like in terms of the items, the HCPCS codes, and CPT codes, modifiers, analysis, and time points, like I mentioned earlier. We'll dive a little deeper into the coverage analysis later on. In terms of making a determination as to whether or not an item is billable or not billable to the patient, there's a couple key areas that are reviewed. One of them is the Medicare coverage rules and regulations, and there's a couple areas within the rules and regulations that are reviewed. The first one is the clinical trial policy, NC 310.1. The Medicare benefit policy manual is also reviewed. As I mentioned earlier, Chapter 14 is for devices, but there's a couple other key chapters that is pertinent to a coverage analysis. And then there's national and local coverage determinations that have implications for billing. Besides the Medicare coverage rules and regulations, for oncology trials, the National Oncology Guidelines are reviewed in terms of the items, or in terms of the disease and intervention, and looking at what's conventional care. The therapy risks and side effects and the monitoring of the risks and side effects are also reviewed. And then finally, the items that the sponsor is offering to pay for in the budget. In terms of why Medicare is specifically used for coverage analysis, there's a couple different reasons. First off, the information is publicly available. Depending on the individual private insurance, information is not always readily available, or not all the information is readily available. Because Medicare is the federal payer, there's significant compliance risk if they're not properly billed. Most institutions also want to follow a standard set of rules or guidelines for consistent billing, so making sure that the same rules are applied to all studies. And they also tend to be more limiting than private payers. So the general idea is if coverage is clear under Medicare, that private insurance generally follows Medicare rules, so there will likely be coverage there as well. In terms of what to do if a study does not even enroll Medicare patients, generally speaking, in terms of consistency, like I mentioned earlier, the Medicare rules can still be cited. A coverage analysis is still important to prevent duplicate billing and also to make sure that there's consistency between patients in the same study and that those patients don't receive an incorrect bill. So what does Medicare cover? So generally speaking, Medicare defines items that are medically necessary as reasonable and necessary to the overall diagnosis and treatment of the patient's condition. As I mentioned earlier, NCD 310.1 is the clinical trial policy. So this is specific to clinical trials in terms of coverage. And there's three main areas where they provide coverage for a clinical trial. The first is conventional care items, which would be those recommended by national guidelines, the Study Drug Administration, and then finally items used to detect, monitor, and treat treatment complications and side effects. Medicare also provides coverage under Chapter 14 for IDE devices. It provides coverage for routine care items, items that would otherwise be furnished outside a trial, so similar to conventional care. The device itself, this depends on the FDA status, but there can be coverage for the actual device. And then it's important to note that the study must be approved by Medicare. So it's kind of two steps in the process: is the FDA status, but then also Medicare must approve the study, and they have a website that lists the IDE studies that are approved. So going a little deeper into each of those areas where Medicare provides coverage in a clinical trial under NCD 310.1, the first is the items provided absent a trial, the conventional care items. This is where the National Oncology guidelines are reviewed to determine what would typically happen for the patient population or for a given intervention, normally even outside of trial. Guidelines include testing recommendations for pre- and post-treatment, along with treatment options based on the stage. And generally speaking, if the item is included in the guidelines, it will be designated as billable to the patient and conventional care and analysis. So just a quick example, a physical exam prior to treatment is conventional care for recurrent breast cancer patients, and the guidelines is cited. The second area is items or services required for the provision of the investigational item or service. So typically speaking, it's the ID administration, but other forms are covered as well. So again, a quick example, coverage for the ID administration of a study drug is supported by NCD 310.1. And then finally, NCD 310.1 provides coverage for items or services used to monitor the effects of the investigational item or service, or for the prevention of complications, or used to monitor or diagnose complications. So essentially, we're looking at side effects in the ICF for the study drug, or we could be looking at the FDA label in terms of drugs that are already on the market. And then tests used to monitor the side effects for the study therapies are usually marked billable to the patient. An example here, the study drug is known to cause decreased blood counts, the ICF is cited. Therefore, a CVC is used to detect, monitor, and treat side effects of the study drug with coverage supported by NCD 310.1 and NCD 190.15. The 190.15 is specific to a CVC. So going a little further into NCDs and LCDs, like I mentioned the example for a CVC, an NCD is a national coverage determination. It's released by CMS and applies nationwide. An LCD is a local coverage determination. It's released by the Medicare contractor, so each regional MAC, and it only applies to that region. A couple things to be aware of as it relates to NCDs and LCDs. They're not written for the research setting. They apply both in clinical trials and outside of clinical trials. They include limitations and indications for Medicare coverage of specific items or services. Generally speaking, coverage is dependent on the patient having signs and symptoms. This is where it's challenging in a coverage analysis for a clinical trial. It's hard to know if every patient will experience signs or symptoms. This is where it's important to look at the side effects in the ICF and the FDA label to determine if it's something that is common, and monitoring would be appropriate for all patients. Coverage can also be limited after a patient has a normal test result, so something to be aware of in terms of applying NCDs and LCDs. One just kind of general note on that, there may be a clinical indication for doing the item or service, but coverage can still be limited. So just because the NCD or LCD limits coverage, it doesn't mean that it's medically inappropriate. In terms of what Medicare does not provide coverage for, generally speaking, it's tests done absent signs or symptoms. There must be medical necessity documented for each item in order to bill Medicare. Looking at NCD 310.1 specifically and what it says is not covered by Medicare, the investigational item itself is not covered unless it would be otherwise available. Items done solely for data collection, so those would be items that do not have medical necessity, and then the items that are provided by the sponsor free of charge, which is somewhat akin to duplicate billing. Since you'd be getting it free of charge, you wouldn't be able to charge the patient for that as well. So in terms of how the coordinators and the administrative team is impacted by the coverage analysis, first looking at before the study even opens, there's a couple areas where the coverage analyst might have some questions for the study team. This includes study logistics, so where it's being done, if the patient's going to be hospitalized, or who will perform certain activities. It also includes standard of care frequencies, how often the PI would normally order scans, would the PI repeat the test, and would the PI order the test outside the study. Scans are the common area where, especially in oncology, sites generally have an institutional standard frequency that will be done. There might be protocol-specific items, particularly if the protocol is not clear, and coding confirmation might be requested, especially for procedures. So again, if the protocol is not clear and the codes would vary depending on what procedure is done, that might be something that the coordinators are reached out to obtain confirmation. In terms of why this is all important, this information all can have impacts in terms of coverage and in terms of finances. And it's important that the billing is consistent both in and out of a trial. So in terms of what is conventional care and standardly done by an institution, it's important that what we're saying is standard of care in the trial also matches what would be standard of care outside of the trial in terms of the conventional care. In terms of some other questions that might come up for the study team, one might be, do you have a journal article or documentation that can be used to bill the drug in the study? So when looking at drugs, the first area that's going to be looked at is whether or not it's used on label. The next one is going to be whether or not it's medically accepted, looking at kind of the common areas that indicate that that's the case. Sometimes it might not be clear that it's medically accepted, and this is where the study team might be helpful in providing documentation that that is the case. Another question that might come up is the oral or IV form of the drug being used? Here, this is important because it makes a difference in terms of coverage. Ideally, that should be clear in the study documents, but it's not always the case. In terms of challenges for the person doing the coverage analysis and how that could relate to questions for the study team, a couple areas of challenges for the analyst. The coverage analysis is completed in advance of any patients being enrolled and must apply to all patients. So like I talked about earlier with NCDs and LCDs, generally speaking, in a normal clinical setting, a patient will come in, exhibit signs and symptoms, and then an appropriate test will be ordered based on those signs and symptoms. Here, we're doing it in advance for all patients, and that makes it more challenging. Guidelines and FDA warnings are also not written specifically for clinical research, and just in general, guidelines often lack frequency recommendations and are fairly limited. So some questions that might come up for the study team related to a coverage analysis: how often do you do this test for non-research patients? Will this test be repeated after the patient is diagnosed? And do you have any guidelines that you would recommend? Just a general note that I mentioned earlier, once the study opens, it's important that the CA is reviewed and used to maintain billing compliance. It's not just an activity that should be completed, it's something that should be utilized by multiple parties once the study opens. In terms of the coordinator using the coverage analysis, some areas where this might come up, to answer cross questions during the consent process, our general recommendation is to always review the coverage analysis to make sure that patients aren't inadvertently being promised items free where they actually are going to their insurance. And just in general, to answer any billing-related questions, so if the person that's doing the bill scope has any questions, the coordinator could provide guidance using the coverage analysis. And then to make billing determinations at the time of the visit. For example, the MRI done at screening, and whether or not that fell into the SOC window. So that's a situation where you would use the coverage analysis and then the patient's chart information to make that determination. Some ways that non-compliance can be prevented, just making sure that all questions from the compliance team are being answered, and letting them know if you think an item should not be billed to the patient, referring to the coverage analysis whenever you talk about billing with the patient, and then if an item is billable for some patients and research for others, like the screening standard of care window example that I just mentioned, making sure that's clearly communicated after the patient visit. In terms of reviewing a coverage analysis, I'm going to pass this off to Ryan now, and he'll take over from here.
All right, thanks, Nicole. So in this part of the talk, I'll be going over the sections that are typically included in a coverage analysis document and what areas you should focus on when reviewing a coverage analysis. So typically the first part, or the first step of completing a coverage analysis is determining the qualifying status. This should also be the starting point for review of a coverage analysis. Mainly it is because there are some billing considerations depending on what the qualifying status actually is. And I'll kind of go through some of the criteria it's evaluated on. In order for NCD 310.1 to qualify, there are a couple categories or criteria that are evaluated. First is the Medicare benefit category. There's over 70 Medicare benefit categories, and the most common are drugs and biologicals, inpatient services, or oral anti-cancer medication. Therapeutic intent is also evaluated. So the trial must test efficacy, not just safety. This can cause some problems for some phase 1-2 studies where there isn't any therapeutic intent in phase 1. Also, diagnosed disease. The trial must enroll patients with a diagnosed disease. It can't just include healthy volunteers. Also, deemed status. In order to acquire deemed status, the study must meet all 7 desirable characteristics defined by NCD 310.1. The trials automatically meet these characteristics when they are funded by a government agency, sponsored by a cooperative group, have an IND, or meet IND exempt criteria. So why is qualifying status important? Clinical trials must qualify for Medicare coverage. If the trial qualifies, Medicare will cover specific categories of NCD 310.1, which Nicole kind of touched on before, and also Medicare benefit policy manual for devices. When trials don't qualify, there will be limitations on what can be billed in the patient, and there are different Medicare claim requirements. So in order for NCD 310.1 for the study to qualify, all 4 of the following criteria must be met. The investigational item must fall under a Medicare benefit category. The trial must have therapeutic intent. The trial must enroll patients with a diagnosed disease or diagnosed with a disease, and the study must be deemed. So what types of studies might not qualify? Kind of as I touched on earlier, phase 1 studies, they often lack therapeutic intent. Investigator-initiated trials rarely are deemed. They do not require an IND number and don't have government funding, so they don't meet the automatically deemed criteria. And then what does a non-qualifying study mean for the patient? Usually they're going to receive fewer bills because there are less items that are billable. So the impact will be seen on the side of the billers as they have to correctly get reimbursement from the sponsor for those items. The next part of a coverage analysis is the billing grid. Typically, the billing grid lays out protocol-required visits by arm. Important to note that this is generally done by arm because different arms may have different treatment, might have different drugs, or schedule entirely. The billing grid can also contain the billing designations and justifications. It could contain research billing modifiers and CPT and HCPCS codes. So this is kind of the sample we showed earlier of a coverage analysis. Along the left-hand side, you've got all of the protocol-required items and procedures. Along the top, there is the schedule of events, so each visit is laid out. And then along the right-hand side, you have the justification comments, where you have the NCDs, LCDs, protocol quoted as justification as to why items are designated the way they are. So there are a couple different designations you might find in a coverage analysis. The first is items that are billable to the patient or insurance. Billable determination is typically made using Medicare rules, the national guidelines, and FDA prescribing information or known side effects of the drug. So that example that we provided earlier was the CBC for pancreatic cancer patients. Based on the underlying condition and the side effects of the study drug, the CBC is billable for patients in the study. And then at the end, the coverage is supported by MC 190.15 and 310.1. Another designation often found in a coverage analysis is a research designation. And what this means is that it's an item that is not billable to the patient. And this can be due to a couple of reasons. One, it might be paid for by the sponsor. It might be limited by a Medicare rule, or billing is not supported. Or finally, it's used for exploratory purposes within the context of the study. There are also research invoiceable items. These are typically the items that don't apply to all patients that are still not billable. Some common items are pregnancy tests and sub-study tests. There can also be, depending on site policies, there can be mixed designations. Nicole kind of touched on this earlier with the screening visits. So split designations are one where the item is billable to some patients and research for others, and it kind of depends on some background information. So the most common reason would be a scan that doesn't fall within a patient's imaging window. Most of the work falls on the coordinator for determining which way the designation should go for each individual patient. The coordinator should review analysis carefully, determine which circumstances the item is billable, and then check the patient's chart to see if that item will be, in fact, billable for that patient. If an item was performed too soon at the screening visit, it would typically be designated research for those patients. But if the patient was due for their next test and the screening visit falls in line with that window, the item could be billable for those patients. Some other designations, one would be items or non-billable or no bill or non-billable items. Typically, these are items where no money is exchanged between the site and the sponsor. The most common example would be the study drug if it's provided by the sponsor free of charge. You could also see a designation for not separately billable items. So an example of this would be the vital signs when a physical exam is performed. The vital signs could be designated as not separately billable. So it's also important to note that an item can have different designations at different visits depending on how it's evaluated. In the example below, the item is marked as billable to the patient at screening and during treatment after cycle 1, and as well as follow-up. This can happen for a couple different reasons. One, it might be that the sponsor is offering to pay for the item at some visits but not others. And then also, protocols might require tests at a before too, the split designations, this could be shown in a couple different ways. In this case, it's the CT scan at screening. For some patients, it will be billable, and for others, it would be research. And again, this depends on the patient's standard of care screening window and if it falls in line. So this was the research billing modifiers are something that can be included in the coverage analysis. Medicare requires research modifiers on items that are being billed as part of a qualifying clinical trial. And there are a couple different modifiers here that you can see. So a Q1 modifier is for items that are billable to the patients. A Q0 modifier will appear on the investigational item itself. So this could be the study drug. And then no is used when no modifier is applicable. This is for when the item is not billed to the patient, or it is happening in the inpatient setting, or it is billable in a non-qualifying trial. So billers can use this column to reference when reviewing patient claims. So here's an example of what the research billing modifier looks like. In the farthest right blue column, there's some examples of how the research modifier would be used. For the split designations, we have the Q1 or no. For when it's billable to the patient, the Q1 will be used, and when it is research, the no, there is no modifier. Another useful item that can be added into a coverage analysis are the CPT codes and HCPCS codes. Nicole kind of touched on it earlier, but the CPT and HCPCS codes are important for determining Medicare coverage. They can also be used for budgeting. A lot of times, pricing for individual items is based off of the CPT codes, and that way it allows for a quick lookup of pricing for individual items when building the budget. The codes are also included in the grid as a good reference for the billers down the line. So some final notes for coverage analysis. It's important to note that all studies involving items potentially billable should have a coverage analysis performed. And then CAs can also be completed for open and new studies. During the review process, there's two different time points where it's important to review the document. First, it's most important to review the document before the study opens to make sure the designations and analysis make sense. It's important to always ask questions if something is unclear. It's a lot easier to change the coverage analysis prior to patients enrolling since no bills have been sent out. And then also, once the patient is enrolled, it's important to review the coverage analysis when consenting the patient to be able to explain to them what types of or which items will be billed to them. And then also using the coverage analysis when performing billing reviews. So some couple final important items. It's important to note that the sponsor cannot pay for items denied by insurance. It violates NCD 310.1. NCD 310.1 states Medicare will not pay for an equivalent item provided free of charge for another payment or another patient. It also creates issues with Medicare's secondary payer rules. Medicare is meant to be the payer of last resort, and in this case, the sponsor becomes the guarantor, and therefore should be the primary payer. Denied claims, it is important to note too that denied claims should follow normal workflows as managed by the revenue cycle team. With that, if there are any questions, feel free to reach out either to myself or Nicole. And also, thank you for listening into this webinar.